All right, so in chapter 15, we're going to focus mostly on the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to do an overview of the nervous system again, where we're going to compare somatic with the autonomic. We're then going to look at the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, the physiology, and then also visceral autonomic reflexes. So remember an overview here of the nervous system. There is a comparison of the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. We see that they are both part of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic is going to communicate with your skeletal muscles, so this is going to be voluntary control, whereas the autonomic is going to be the involuntary effectors like your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and your gland. Now remember that the autonomic can also be subdivided into the sympathetic division, which is your fight or flight, and the parasympathetic division, which is the rest and digest. So when we look at the sensory neurons, we can see in the somatic system, they are going to be consciously perceived. These are going to be your special senses like your eyes, ears, nose, and taste. So sensory input's going to come from them. When we look at the autonomic, they're not going to be consciously perceived, but they're still going to receive a lot of these signals from your special senses. We see that there's going to be general somatic senses like pain, temperature, and touch. See the same thing in the autonomic, but it's going to be coming again from areas that perception you're not aware of. We see that with the autonomic, these are mostly going to come from your general visceral receptors. These are also known as interoreceptors because they are going to be found inside on your internal organs. Okay, so these are located in your blood vessels, your organs, and also inside of your muscles. So motor neurons and their pathways, when we look at somatic and autonomic, somatic motor neurons are going to have their cell body in the central nervous system. We see that it's going to be a single neuron synapsis, which is going to directly come in contact with the effector. So we have that presynaptic neuron is going to come into contact with the effector, and in this case is the skeletal muscle. They are going to release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Now, there's going to be some differences when we look at the autonomic neurons. So when we look at the autonomic motor neurons, there's going to be a preganglionic motor neuron. This preganglionic motor neuron is going to have its cell body also in the central nervous system. But it's going to have its myelinated axon extending from the central nervous system, and it's going to talk to a second motor neuron. Okay, so this is how it's different than somatic. They're going to release acetylcholine. So they are going to still release acetylcholine to the second motor neuron. Now, since there is a second motor neuron, this is known as the postganglionic motor neuron. The postganglionic motor neuron's cell body is going to be in the autonomic ganglion, which is outside of the central nervous system. Now remember, a ganglia or ganglion is in the peripheral nervous system. These are going to have an unmyelinated axon. So the synapsis is going to be with some sort of effector, but it's going to be with an unmyelinated axon. They will release either acetylcholine if they're part of the parasympathetic nervous system, or they're going to release norepinephrine if they're part of the sympathetic nervous system. They're going to release these particular types of neurotransmitters to the effectors, whoever they're talking to, whether it's glands, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, so on. So let's look at the sympathetic division first. When we look at the sympathetic division, the preganglionic cell bodies are located in the lateral gray horns that we talked about back in chapter 13. Remember that these lateral gray horns are in the thoracic area as well as into the upper lumbar. So it's T1 to L3. This is why this particular group is called the thoracolumbar division, because their cell bodies are going to be found in the thoracic and lumbar areas of the spinal cord. The parasympathetic division is going to have its preganglionic cell bodies located in the cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem, and also the lateral gray horns of the S2 and S4, which are the sacral regions. This is why the parasympathetic division is also known as the craniosacral division, because its cell bodies are located in the cranial nerves as well as in the sacral area. So craniosacral division. Now, in addition to the ganglia, the autonomic nervous system also contains some autonomic plexuses that are present. Okay, so these are going to be clusters of nerves that are going to talk to certain areas. You'll notice in this, you'll see that the sympathetic ganglia are going to be next to the actual spinal cord, so they're going to be closer to the spinal cord. And you can see you have the cardiac plexus, a pulmonary, esophageal, right sympathetic trunk ganglion, inferior mesenteric, that sort of thing, but you'll notice that all of them are located close to the spinal cord. In the parasympathetic, the ganglia are actually located closer to the organs. Okay, so these ganglia are going to be closer to each of the organs that they are going to communicate with. Okay, whether we're talking about the aortic, the cardiac pulmonary, the celiac, these are all going to be closer to those particular organs. Now, response to neurotransmitters are going to vary. The somatic response is always excitation, they get excited, but in the autonomic, we see that the response could either be that the nerves get excited or they will inhibit an area. Each neuron is going to receive thousands of excitatory and inhibitory signals every second. So again, it's going to be that summation of, are there more excitatory or are there more inhibitory that are coming in to create those graded potentials. So let's do a little overview of the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system. So with the somatic, we see that it's going to bring general and special senses, but where the autonomic is going to get from its general and special senses as well, but it's different in the sense that it's going to get information from the interoreceptors, which are the visceral or organ receptors. Somatic nervous system is going to have voluntary control from your cerebral cortex, whereas the autonomic is going to have involuntary control. This involuntary control is going to be coming from the hypothalamus and limbic system in your brain. The somatic system is a one-way path, but the autonomic is a two-way pathway. And we're talking about the whole idea of the neuron. There's one neuron in the somatic, but there's a two neuron in the autonomic, the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. The effectors for somatic nervous system are going to be skeletal muscles. For autonomic, it's going to be cardiac, smooth muscles, and glands. And then for the somatic, we see that there's going to be contraction of the skeletal muscles, but in the autonomic, it depends. In some cases, there would be either an increase or decrease in the cardiac muscle for the heart rate or the force. We see that when we talk about the smooth muscle, it could cause a contraction or relaxation. All right, so it just depends. From glands, it could increase or decrease their secretions. Again, it depends on what kind of neurotransmitters released, if it's from the sympathetic or the parasympathetic. All right, so this takes the information we talked about previously, puts it into a chart for you. All right, so now let's compare the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic divisions. All right, so when we look at the preganglionic cell bodies, they are located in the sympathetic in the thoracolumbar area. In the parasympathetic, they're found in the craniosacral areas. Now, the location of the ganglia. The sympathetic is going to be close to the central nervous system. The parasympathetic is going to be close to the viscera, or what we call the organ. Now, the length of the preganglionic axon. Since the ganglia are close to the central nervous system in the sympathetic, these preganglionic axons are going to be short. Since the ganglia are going to be closer to the organ in the parasympathetic, these preganglionic axons are going to be long, which means that the type of preganglionic neuron for the sympathetic and the parasympathetic are going to be cholergenic because they are both going to be releasing acetylcholine. On the other hand, the types of postganglionic neurons, they are going to vary. The sympathetic is going to be androgenic, where it's going to release epinephrine or norepinephrine, but the parasympathetic is going to also continue to be cholergenic, releasing acetylcholine. Now, the duration of their effects, it's going to depend. The sympathetic is going to have a longer lasting effect. The parasympathetic is going to have a shorter effect. It's a short-term effect. So if you'll notice, a lot of them are opposites. So the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, we see that there's going to be an output, or we call the efferent or motor part of the autonomic system, is divided into two main parts. There's the sympathetic division, known as the S, and this, remember, is the thoracolumbar. This is going to prepare the body for emergency or stress type situations. This is why it's termed a lot of times the fight or flight division. Okay, it's going to deal with the 3 F's, which are fear, fight, or flight, and the 4 E's, which are exercise, excitement, emergency, and embarrassment. These activities are going to cause you to use up energy. This could either be during physical or emotional stress. The sympathetic is going to dominate over the parasympathetic division. The effects of the sympathetic division tend to be a longer lasting effect. So some structures. When we look at the motor neurons, they are located here in the blue. The cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are found in the lateral gray horns of T1 through L3. The chain ganglia are located closer to the central nervous system. So you can notice here in the picture it's closer to the spinal cord. The preganglionic axons are short. The preganglionic motor nerve fibers are cholergenic because they are releasing acetylcholine. But the postganglionic motor neuron fibers are anergenic because they are releasing norepinephrine. And the sympathetic fibers are found throughout the entire body, which you can see based on these pictures. Innervation of the adrenal gland, though, is different here. There is a direct innervation of the sympathetic preganglionic axons. Only myelinated nerve fibers are coming in here. So the cortex, or the outer part of the adrenal glands, are going to be an endocrine gland that stimulates many what we call adrenocorticohormones. The medulla is the inner part, and it's going to secrete neurotransmitter hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to stress. So this is going to be effects of all visceral organs at once. The purpose is to amplify the sympathetic stress response. This is also why it lasts longer, okay, because there's also a hormone component. So this is going to be where the nervous and endocrine systems are interwoven and working together. So this is it's a different type of innervation with the adrenal gland than we see with the rest of the organs with the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the parasympathetic division, also known as the PS, is the craniosacral. This is going to return the body to its calm state, which we also term as rest and digest state. It's going to stimulate the body's activities involved in getting and saving energy. So like digestion and absorption of your GI tract helps you get energy. We also see it is going to help include elimination of waste like urination and defecation. Okay, this is where you can look at SLUD here, which is salivation, lacrimation, urination, and defecation. Okay, so the parasympathetic division is going to help those 4 things take place. The effects of the parasympathetic division tend to be more short term, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that there's not going to be that innervation or intertwiningness between the parasympathetic and the hormone or endocrine system. So let's look at the structures. The motor neurons of this parasympathetic nervous system are shown in red. The cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are going to be found in the cranial nerve, nuclei in the brainstem, and also the lateral gray horn of S2 through 4. The ganglia are located closer to the visceral or farther away from the central nervous system. The preganglionic axons then are long, okay, because they're going to travel and be closer to the organs themselves. The pre- and postganglionic motor fibers are going to both release acetylcholine, so they are considered cholergenic. And the parasympathetic fibers are found mostly in the head, thorax, abdomen, and pelvis. Okay, when we look at this, guys, there is a note here there are 12 cranial nerves. These 12 cranial nerves are named based on Roman numerals. 4 are part of the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, and one of them is the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is number 10, and it innervates the cardiovascular, respiratory, and visceral organs. All right, and so it's going to help calm down the heart and the breathing and that sort of thing. All right, so this is a quick little note. On this next slide, you're going to see that these are the cranial nerves. They are labeled by the Roman numerals. Okay, so they're going to be Roman numerals 1 through 12. The vagus nerve is the one that's really important here, but you'll notice that a lot of them are going to play a role as part of the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. Now, guys, we will talk a little bit more about these cranial nerves in anatomy 2. Now, most organs are going to receive impulses or messages from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. This is called a dual innervation. Okay, so they're innervated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Usually one division is going to excite that particular organ, and the other is going to inhibit that particular organ. So not always the same division is going to do that. So let's just use kind of an example. So with the heart, the sympathetic is going to excite the heart and make it beat faster, whereas the parasympathetic is going to inhibit the heart and cause it to slow down. Now with digestion, the sympathetic is going to decrease digestion, but the parasympathetic is going to increase digestion. So it depends on the location, and it depends on which division is talking to it. Now, neurons of the autonomic nervous system. Cholergenic neurons are going to release the acetylcholine. They may be excitatory or inhibitory. So all sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are cholergenic. All parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are cholergenic. Now, there are some sympathetic postganglionic neurons that are cholergenic, like your sweat glands and certain blood vessels, but they're going to fall in the next type mostly. So anergenic neurons are going to release epinephrine or norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline or adrenaline. Most sympathetic postganglionic axons are anergenic, so they're going to release normally norepinephrine. They may again be excitatory or inhibitory. So guys, the same neurotransmitter can give a different signal based on the receptor that's present. Some receptors are going to cause it to excite it, and other receptors are going to cause it to inhibit that organ. So when we look at receptors for neurotransmitters, we see cholergenic receptors are going to be specifically responding to acetylcholine. So nicotinic receptors are going to be excitatory. They're going to depolarize. Whereas what we call muscarinic receptors are going to either be excitatory or inhibitory depending on the effector cell that they're going to talk to. So this just kind of gives you a little table or chart that shows you these types of cholergenic receptors, their major location, and their effects that occur. Anergenic receptors are going to be specifically responding to epinephrine or norepinephrine. There's what we call alpha 1 and beta 1 receptors. These are usually going to be excitatory, but there are some exceptions. The alpha 1 receptors are normally in the artery walls, whereas the beta 1 receptors are in the cardiac muscles. They either stimulate vasoconstriction and also stimulate increased heart rate. So these are usually going to excite those organs. Alpha 2 and beta 2 receptors are going to usually be inhibitory. Again, there are some exceptions. Alpha 2 receptors example is in the pancreas. This is going to, when stimulated, cause a decrease in insulin secretion. Alpha 2 receptors in your bronchi and your arteries, when stimulated, could cause bronchodilation and vasodilation. Okay, so usually these will be an inhibitory type of effect because of those specific receptors that are present. Now, norepinephrine is going to stimulate a lot of times the alpha receptors better than it does the beta receptors. Epinephrine tends to stimulate both alpha and beta equally. And the effects of the sympathetic stimulation are longer lasting than the parasympathetic. The acetylcholinease inactivates acetylcholine very quickly, so norepinephrine remains in the cleft longer. And also epinephrine is also secreted into the blood by the adrenal medulla as well. Okay, so that's the hormone part also coming into play. Now, certain drugs can bind to certain receptors and either activate or mimic their effects of the neurotransmitter, or they can block them. So when we look at cholergenic, this can prolong the action of acetylcholine. This is used to treat diseases like myasthenia gravis. It causes it to increase muscle tone. We also see that we could use anti-anergenic types of drugs, which are going to block impulse conductions from the sympathetic postganglionic fibers. These could be non-selective beta blockers. They can bind to all types of beta receptors and prevent activation of epinephrine and norepinephrine. A lot of times you might hear about beta blockers when we talk about blood pressure, because they want to help lower blood pressure. Alpha blockers can also block activation of the alpha receptors by norepinephrine, again to lower blood pressure. Okay, so both of these will help with hypertension, but it depends on which ones we want to target, the beta receptors or the alpha receptors. Anticholergenic is going to block impulse conductions of the parasympathetic fibers. This is going to interfere with binding of the acetylcholine to its receptors. These are used to treat muscle spasms. It's also used to treat bradycardia, where the heart rate is too low, irritable bowels, and also Parkinson's disease. Okay, so these are just different ways that we are able to use drugs that mimic or block these receptors so that these signals cannot be received the same way. the physiology of the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic division is the stress state. It increases energy demands for survival mode. So releasing glucose, the breaking down of glucagon to glucose is called glycogenolysis. This is going to increase the need of oxygen as well as nutrients. This is going to drive a lot of catabolic reactions, if you recall back from chapter 2. The parasympathetic division is the relaxation state. This is going to decrease energy demands. It's going to allow you to store glucose, called glycogenesis, because we're going to store it away, and also the storage of lipids, which is lipogenesis. These are going to be more of the anabolic reactions where we're going to build things up. Now, typically not on the extreme ends, there's intermediate stages that are happening. So in your body, there's a constant kind of back and forth between these two. And this can happen even within minutes of each other, where one might be in more control than the other, and so on. So let's look at the overview of the effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So on the adrenal medulla, the sympathetic is going to cause secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine, but the parasympathetic is not going to even talk to the adrenals. There's no innervation with the adrenal glands. Production of sweat and goosebumps. We see that increased sweat is going to happen in most body areas with the sympathetic nervous system, as well as contraction of the arrector pili, which are for the goosebumps. We do not see this with the parasympathetic. There's no innervation. With the liver is going to be innervated by both. So this is that dual innervation. The sympathetic is going to cause glycogenolysis. It's going to allow for the blood glucose levels to raise, whereas glycogenesis is going to take place with the parasympathetic to lower the blood glucose levels, to store it away. Heart rate is also going to have a dual innervation with the heart. So the sympathetic is going to increase heart rate and contraction, whereas parasympathetic is going to decrease heart rate and the force of contraction. With the pupils, the sympathetic is going to dilate the pupils, whereas the parasympathetic is going to constrict the pupils. And then with the lungs, the sympathetic is going to cause bronchodilation to increase respiration rates, whereas the parasympathetic is going to cause bronchoconstriction and decrease the respiration rate. So again, you'll notice that these are opposites. Some other examples are going to be with the stomach and the intestines. The sympathetic is going to decrease the activity of the GI tract. It's going to cause a contraction of the sphincters, whereas the parasympathetic is going to increase the activity of the GI tract and relax the sphincters. In the bladder, we see that the sympathetic is going to cause contraction of the internal sphincter, but relaxation of the muscular walls. In the parasympathetic, it's going to cause relaxation of the internal sphincter and contraction of the muscular walls. With the uterus, the sympathetic is going to inhibit contractions in non-pregnant women. This promotes labor contractions, though, in pregnant women. We see that in the sex organs, the sympathetic is going to be the contraction of smooth muscle resulting in ejaculation in males, but the parasympathetic is going to cause the vasodilation for erection to take place in both sexes. So the parasympathetic has to be in charge first before ejaculation can take place, which is overridden by the sympathetic nervous system. With blood pressure, the sympathetic nervous system is going to cause an increase, whereas the parasympathetic is going to cause a decrease. With blood vessels to vital organs, the sympathetic is going to cause vasodilation, whereas the parasympathetic is going to cause vasoconstriction. And then the blood vessels to non-vital organs are going to be the opposite. Sympathetic is going to cause vasoconstriction, and parasympathetic is going to cause vasodilation. All right, so this brings us to visceral autonomic reflexes. These reflexes adjust the activity of your visceral or effectors. This is usually unconscious because your visceral are your organs. This is going to be like a change in your heart rate, your blood pressure, or your respiration rate. Vasoconstriction or vasodilation of your blood vessels, so getting the constriction or the dilation. And pupillary constriction or dilation. You're not even aware that these things are taking place. The brain is just going to take care of it for you. Okay, so these are some examples of those visceral autonomic reflexes. So let's look at the autonomic reflex arc. It's just like any other reflex arc. We have the receptor, which is located throughout the body. The sensory neurons located also throughout the body is going to carry the information towards the central nervous system. These association neurons are going to be located in the spinal cord, medulla, or hypothalamus of the brain. The autonomic motor neurons are going to be the preganglionic sympathetic axons, remember, are short. Parasympathetic axons are long. With the postganglionic, the sympathetic axons are anergenic. The postsympathetic axons are cholinergic. This is going to cause a visceral effect to take place, so the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or gland is going to react. Whether it contracts or relaxes or secretes or decreases secretion depends on the communication that was given. The last thing here, guys, is you need to know that the hypothalamus does control and integrate the autonomic nervous system. It's like the switch station. The hypothalamus contains a lot of those areas for homeostasis, and so it's going to determine if the sympathetic or parasympathetic needs to kind of be in charge at that time. So it's monitoring both of those subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system.